Well, hey there, greetings, salutations, all of that. It's been a while since I introduced myself, so my name is Jules, and today I'm building a microhome for 8 Sims. So I got to thinking that it had been a while since I did this challenge, and I wanted to try it again, but I wanted to do it a little bit differently this time. So for starters, I built this microhome with a family of 8 Sims in mind. Last time it was more of a roommate situation. And secondly, the style of this home is a lot different than the last one. This time I was pretty inspired by like those stereotypical witches' cabins. And of course, the most important feature to convey that look, in my opinion at least, is the roof. So here you see me putting the roof on for the first time, which it will change slightly later because I am going to change the layout of the house a little bit. And let me just say, at least from my perspective, one of the hardest things about building tiny homes is getting the roof just right. I am definitely not a master roofer, but I do like my roofs to at least kind of look like they make sense. Now, most of the furniture that I have on the inside is basically just a placeholder at this point. I knew that I wanted them to have at least a semi-functional kitchen inside the house, and now we're just going to hop right back out to the exterior. And while I didn't intend them to be, the doors and windows kind of end up being placeholders as well. I had added those columns for a little bit of added interest to the front of the house, but I do decide to take them away later, mostly because any windows that I placed with them there just look kind of odd. And of course, any proper cottage in the woods needs a thatched roof. I am going to be changing up the roof trim a little later too, because this particular trim is so thick that it just kept clipping, and I couldn't make the roofs any smaller than they already were. You might notice here that this first window I'm placing doesn't look too out of place. But as soon as I place that second window, it kind of looks like a toddler put a random sticker on. So this is the part where I decided that I wanted my Sims to have a living space with a couch and a TV. Originally, I didn't want to use a Murphy bed because I wanted the interior to kind of match the exterior and have like country cottagey vibes. But I realized the only way to get that living area was with the Murphy bed. So I decided to go with my usual, more eclectic style. And now that we're moving the kids and teens upstairs, I realized that the only way to make the beds fit was to change the loft area a little bit, which of course also meant that I would have to change the roof. At this point, I'm reconfiguring the loft to make sure that it stays open to the lower level. And I'm putting that tiny little fence on to close it off, but still make it look completely open. Next, I had to start removing the roof so I could put a new one on that made more sense with the new layout. And I'm sure you can see that roof trim poking through, but as I said, we'll fix that a little later. And now I'm just arranging the beds in the loft. It's definitely a small space, but there is enough room for your Sims to actually spend some time up here. The kids and teens can sit on the bed and read books or do their homework, and I'll be adding a couple more things in there as well. I really wanted to try to put a desk in their room so they could sit at that to do their homework, but that didn't work out so well. I thought, oh, well, I'll use one of these space-saving desks. That'll fit fine. But the one thing I forgot was they also need a chair to sit on at the desk. And the chair would make it so they couldn't access the beds. So I decided to put a dollhouse in instead. And of course, I sized it down, so it made a little more sense in the space, and your Sims can still use it as they normally would. On the other side of the room, I wanted the kids to have a bookshelf. It took me a while to find the right one, but I really liked the way this one fit, and it still gave them access to the bed and the ladder. And since there's not really room for a toy chest, I just added a couple of toys to the shelves. And finally, I decided to tuck the radio into the corner. And of course, for added entertainment, since they actually have a sofa to sit on now, we're going to add a TV downstairs. I thought the dollhouse looked a little silly, so I sized it back up slightly. And now it was time to get the flooring in. I definitely wanted them to have wood flooring that showed the grain, so this cottage living swatch seemed to work out the best. And this is the part where I start working on details like area rugs and color swatches. I always think this braided rug looks very country, but it didn't really work in this space. I think it was the color. So I decided to use a couple different options, and none of those really worked out quite right until I got to the cottage living swatch, and that seemed perfect. I originally had the werewolf pack tarp curtains to block off the infant and toddler areas, but I felt like it looked a little sloppy. But no matter which divider I tried to use or if I added half walls, the Sims couldn't get to the crib or the toddler bed. This one worked out okay, but it was basically floating, and even though it doesn't really matter in The Sims, that just didn't work for me. So now I'm going to start tiling the bathroom, and I wanted to keep it pretty simple and neutral. You probably noticed that I only have a toilet and a shower in the bathroom. I pretty much always use a shared sink in my micro homes for the kitchen and the bathroom. There's really not a need to have two, and even though we have an infant and a toddler, we don't really need a bathtub because they can clean them up at the sink. I will admit that the only thing that this build is really missing to make it completely functional is a potty for the toddler. But you can add one in later somewhere, maybe outside if you want. And I just added a few more details like a towel rack and the toilet paper roll, and the bathroom's pretty much complete. Now, I definitely still wanted to divide off the infant and the toddler, I guess to give the illusion of giving mom and dad a little bit of privacy. And I realized that curtains were really the only option to keep them functional and still kind of look okay. And in retrospect, probably makes more sense to have mom and dad downstairs anyway, because they'd need to be close by to care for the little ones. Now, I guess you could kind of say that I cheated on the 8 sim count by having an infant and a toddler for this build, since the crib and toddler bed only take up 2 tiles. But hey, 8 sims is still 8 sims. And yes, your sims will outgrow this house as soon as your toddler ages up, but then again, maybe not. In my test family, I included 2 teens. So maybe by the time your toddler ages up to be a child, one of the teens will be off to college. And then, of course, you'll have room for another baby, and you can just go on indefinitely, just having mom and dad reproduce like rabbits. To be completely honest with you, that's kind of how I play The Sims anyway. I'm always interested to hear what type of simmer other people are. Do you like to torture your Sims? Do you like to build? Do you prefer to go and cast and create new Sims? Are you a family simmer? Do you prefer to have a single Sim? I am definitely 100% a family simmer. I like to play generationally, and a lot of times my Sims will be having kids even after their other kids grew up and moved out and are having kids of their own. As a matter of fact, in my first ever save in The Sims 4, I made a single Sim and moved her into, I think it's called Crick Cabana, that ugly little starter in Willow Creek. And Summer and Liberty and Travis came over as the welcome wagon. And within 5 minutes of having met him, she was almost instantly engaged to Travis. And very shortly after that, they got married. Pretty much just because he was the first man that she saw. And they then proceeded to have 9 children. Yes, 9. And if I remember correctly, 6 were biological and 3 were adopted. So anyway, back to the build. So we're working on the exterior now, and I really wanted to do like a paneling type vibe, like really old weathered wood. And even though it doesn't theoretically make sense, what seemed to work the best for the vibe I was going for was this swatch from Island Living. And now I'm just going back into the house and kind of tweaking things, changing the swatches so that I'm happier with them. And then I'm going to hop back outside so I can start on the landscaping. I really love to build in The Sims, but I have to be honest and say that making speed build videos is not exactly my favorite. And I think that's because I go into them thinking that it's going to be a quick video to record, especially in a case like this, because honestly, how long could it possibly take to build a micro home? It's only 32 tiles. But my over-anxious brain kind of betrays me, and I get way too into the details, and I keep changing things, and I'm super indecisive, and I can't decide on anything, and I have to shift things to get them in the right place. So, 4 to 6-ish hours later, the build is finally complete. I may or may not be exaggerating slightly. But honestly, is this just me? Like, how long does it take you typically to complete a build? Because I feel like it takes me way too long. So right now I'm building an outdoor pavilion. I was kind of thinking along the lines of like a campgrounds or like a park where you would have like just this little pavilion with some picnic tables under it. And I'm adding that so that they have a dining space, because obviously there's not really enough room in the house, as usual, for them to sit at a table and eat. So we're just going to put a picnic table under here, and I put a fan for a little bit of realism, get some air circulation in there. And the nice thing is that because it's covered, they can eat there even in the rain and possibly even in the snow, as long as they have their winter clothes on, of course. We wouldn't want anyone to freeze to death at the family dinner table now, would we? But speaking of being indecisive, while I really loved how this little pavilion turned out, I decided later that I didn't really care for the angle that it was on. I wanted to be slanted a little bit more. So I'm going to demolish that and rebuild it all over again. I knew this house needed a stone path, and I wanted a couple of little flower beds out front, mostly with wildflowers in them. I always have a little bit of trouble getting curving paths just right, but I think that one turned out okay. And here I'm adding a little bit of like worn grass towards the pavilion, just to give the illusion that your Sims are frequently walking there from the house, and it's kind of like the shortcut path. I'm so envious of people who just quickly place down terrain paint and it looks absolutely perfect. I really struggle with that. If you have any tips and tricks to do that a little more easily or make it look a little better, I would really appreciate your advice. So go ahead and leave a comment below. So I wanted them to have at least a few cooking options. So I decided to give them this like fire pit grill thing. I'm sorry, don't remember what it's called. So that they could have cooked food from that, as well as from the little oven that's inside on top of the mini fridge. I am going to end up moving this though, of course, like I keep changing everything, because I decided that it made more sense to have just a campfire in the middle of this little seating area. So I'm going to end up moving the fire pit over to the other side. Is that what it's called? Yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm going to add an area rug to the kids' room, and you'll probably see me jumping back in the house to add little details here and there, because my brain works in a way that if I don't do something as soon as I think of it, I'll forget to do it later. But for the most part, you're going to see me mostly working on the exterior, getting the windows and doors just right. And here we are inside again, adding some wall decals. And here I'm going to be drawing out the flower beds to put those wildflowers in that I talked about earlier. I do add a couple of other flowers and like bushes, rose bushes, I think, in the front. These are the aspects that take me a lot of time, because it takes me a lot of time to decide exactly what I want. I'm trying to kind of get it to look the way I pictured it in my mind. And I do think wildflowers kind of work out best, because I picture this mom, or pretty much anyone who lives in this house, being the type that doesn't really have a whole lot of time for things like gardening. So maybe they just scattered some seeds in the existing flower beds, or maybe they got a little bit overgrown and there's some, quote, weeds growing in there as well. But you know what they say, a weed is just a flower somewhere that you don't want it. Personally, I don't really think there is any such thing as weeds. I mean, unless, of course, you're talking about something that's going to take over your entire flower bed and just look unsightly. But I am pretty happy with the way these flower beds turned out. I think they look really cute, and they definitely fit the vibe that I was going for. And this, of course, is the part where I decided to move the fire pit over to the other side of the yard and place a campfire instead. But that meant that I also had to erase all the terrain paint that was under the fire pit and the seating, and kind of start over with that. And coming up, this is when I decided that I didn't like the pavilion being straight on, mostly because I went to see what it looked like on the gallery, and I didn't really care for it. So I wanted you to be able to kind of see into the pavilion area. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the diagonal pavilion and put all the pillars back, put the diagonal roof on, and then kind of go from there. And of course, I had to go ahead and delete all the walls as well as the floor under the pavilion to make sure that this doesn't add to the tile count for the lot. And now I am attempting to hand draw straight-ish lines for the gravel under the pavilion. I have to say that this was probably my least favorite thing to do in this build. I could not get them as straight as I wanted. But then I just basically convinced myself that gravel kind of spills and curves and it wouldn't look perfect anyway. But it did really make me wish that there was a diagonal terrain paint tool. But aside from the terrain paint, I'm actually happier with the way the pavilion turned out when I redid it anyway. I feel like I got the pitch of the roof just right, and I really like the color swatches that I chose. I did add one high chair under the pavilion. I figured that it's probably pretty unlikely that you're going to need to have both the infant and the toddler in the high chair at the same time. And then I just decided to add some things for detail, like this picnic basket. Going back over to the side of the house, I'm going to add some wisteria. And I'm going to, at some point, also add some ivy, put a little teapot on the table, move that fire pit over, just kind of tweaking the wisteria to get it in the right position where I like it and where I kind of think it makes sense around the doors and windows. Although in real life, I'm sure it would be growing over the windows. But maybe not. Maybe they're not so great at gardening, but they do keep the weeds growing up the side of their house trimmed. Just adding the windows, and I'm going to add a vent to the back of the house as well. And the reason I put the vent there instead of a window, that's where the infant sleeps. And in my mind, those two areas where the infant and the toddler are were closets. And they just kind of removed the doors and tucked the cribs back in there. So being that they were originally like pantry closets, they wouldn't have windows in them. So it just made more sense to me. Just have a vent. You could have a vent in there, depending on what kind of foods you were keeping in there. And at this point, I am drawing in some garden plots because I feel like the family in this house would definitely want to live off the land as much. And here's where I add in the ivy. And of course, this house 100% needs a chicken coop. I definitely overthought the colors for the chicken coop as well. I kind of wanted them to complement the house, but at the same time, I wanted to look like something that they made with scraps, didn't necessarily have paint for, and things like that. And now I'm just going to place the country bicycle in front of the house for a little bit of added interest. This is where I get really into the details, like the cooler under the pavilion. I had put this tree in the back. I just thought it looked really cute with the lanterns and all, getting the terrain paint under the tree and under the extra garden plots that I put in the back of the house. There is definitely a lot for the Sims to do here and to kind of keep themselves busy if you play it a certain way. I really tried to think things through as far as what kind of things like mailboxes and garbage cans someone who lived in this house would have. So that's kind of why I chose the ones that I did. And I think they worked out pretty well. And of course, I had to add a woohoo bush out back for two reasons. One, because there's no enclosed shower and because the double bed is against the wall, there's nowhere else in this house for mom and dad to woohoo. But also because, 8 Sims, 1 toilet, I figured it was probably a good idea to have an extra place for them to go to the bathroom. By the way, how disgusting is that? You pee there, you probably poop there, then you sleep there, and sometimes you even woohoo there. And now I'm just putting in the outdoor lighting so that they can see somewhat outside in the dark. It is still kind of dark, but I wanted to keep the vibe of fuel lamps and torches and that kind of thing. So I didn't want it to be too bright and overpowering. And then I decided that I wanted to add in some fireflies just randomly on the lot. That's something that I really like to do when I'm working on a cottage or rustic build. And honestly, those tend to be one of my favorite types of houses to build. What's your favorite type? Let me know what you kind of gravitate towards when you're building in The Sims. And then, as I said, just going back inside to change some of the color swatches and just refine a few things, adding in the little tiny details. Even though it felt like this build took me about 5 years, I am pretty happy with the way it turned out. I think it's really cute. And actually, I think I'd like to live here, but definitely not with 7 other people. This is not the type of house where you can expect to get any alone time. Yeah, I didn't mean it like that. Get your mind out of the gutter. But honestly, I would not thrive here if it was filled with other people. If it was just me, or like just me and a partner, maybe, or me and like one other friend that slept downstairs while I slept upstairs, or vice versa, it it might work out. I think I'd really enjoy it. I know I'd enjoy the gardening and the chickens and all that stuff. So it's kind of a fun concept to think about. And by the way, in case you're wondering, I did place that test family in this house and I tested everything, so it's completely functional. Some of the things they're interacting with might look a little bit weird. The dollhouse, for example, your Sims are definitely going to clip with the bottom bunk whenever they're playing with that. But it absolutely does still work. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have been enjoying it, get your hammer out and go ahead and whack that like button. Just remember not to hit it too hard because we wouldn't want it to shatter. So that, friends, is our build story, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!